In the dead of night, when everyone had already gone to bed, in the small town of Ashford, some strange energy began to slowly penetrate the earth. Soon the first signs appeared indicating that something unusual and terrible was happening. The residents of Ashford, waking up the next morning, found that their rooms and houses were filled with cold, ominous breath. There was a thick, dead smell everywhere, as if someone from the graves had returned to earth. So the living dead appeared, pale and distorted bodies that imperiously walked through the city streets. They didn't need oxygen or food, and if a few decades ago they could have been ordinary people, now their dead eyes radiated only fear and thirst for revenge. The people from Ashford were paralyzed with terror. They fled. But the living dead did not leave them alone. They were slowly but inexorably approaching, and their cold hands left behind only death and destruction. Greek Stanley, a local biology teacher, realized that he had to do something. He gathered a group of survivors and began to look for a way to stop the living dead. Together they went to the old cemetery where it was supposed to have started. At the road leading to the cemetery, they were met by a revived dead man, once a hound dog, now distorted and filled with boundless malice. The Greek boldly grabbed an old Molotov cocktail from his backpack and set the creature on fire. Flames engulfed his body, and it disappeared into the night as if it did not exist. Following forward, the group was able to find an ancient magical artifact, a source of sinister energy that revived the dead. The Greek and his friends realized that if they destroyed this artifact, they could stop this whole catastrophe. They made their way inside the cemetery, where the living dead guarded the artifact, and the fight began. Despite the supernatural strength of their opponents, the group survived. The Greek charged while his comrades distracted the revived dead. Shifting from shadow to shadow, the Greek reached the altar and destroyed the artifact. Light burst out from the ruins of the altar, mixing with them, and the gloomy aura that enveloped Ashford began to gradually disappear. All the living dead crumbled to dust, and the residents of Ashford were able to breathe freely, realizing that the hell that befell their city was finally over. Over time, the residents of Ashford have completely forgotten about the nightmare that once gripped their city. They restored their homes, resumed normal life, and thought that all the terrible events were behind them. However, in the deep bowels of the cemetery, a small fragment of an artifact was preserved, which the Greek could not completely destroy. This remains behaved quietly and imperceptibly, but tirelessly absorbed dark energy from the environment and revived the sinister creatures that had previously created chaos. Ashford residents began to notice strange changes in their city. The flowers withered, the water in the wells became bitter, and the animals behaved unusually aggressively. But most of all, I was worried about the usual passing by the cemetery. They noticed that the revived dead began to appear again, but in smaller numbers and more cunningly. Ashford was enveloped by an invisible evil, penetrating into every house, filling it with fear and despair. People began to disappear without a trace, and expressions of deep horror remained on their faces. But no one dared to talk about what was happening out loud, because the fear was so deafening that every word seemed only a surge of strength of these sinister creatures. Soon the spirits of the departed residents of Ashford lured people to the cemetery, where they were waiting for a terrible attack of the living dead. The group of survivors remaining from the first wave of the attack gathered again. At the head was Edward, the savior who had helped them last time. They went to the cemetery, where a terrible sight awaited them. Dead bodies stood around an inexplicable symbol radiating dark energy. All attempts to destroy the symbol were in vain. It was too strong and guarded by the most terrible dead. All the inhabitants, saviors and fighters against evil, decided to unite and use their last strength to create a powerful protective magical barrier around the cemetery. They were preparing for the last clash, knowing that victory could be the last in their lives. The power of the sinister symbol only increased when the last black ribbon of hope fell. In the cemetery at dusk, a group of saviors gathered in a circle, each putting their strength into a spell. They merged together and raised their bound hands to the sky. A bright light flashed, and a magical barrier wall flashed around the cemetery. The revived dead began to get stuck inside, but their continuous attacks did not subside. They pushed and pulled out from under the wall, but to no avail. The barrier sealed the graveyard and absorbed the sinister symbol, cutting it off from the source of dark energy. Edward and the remaining saviors knew that, despite the fact that they had won, evil never leaves the world completely. It is only waiting for its next chance, its next awakening. But Ashford, thanks to the courage and determination of ordinary people, was able to remain holy and protected from evil. The dark forces slowly began to disappear, and the residents of Ashford felt a slight relief. However, the shadow of the threat remained, hidden in the dark corners of possible horror. And every resident of the city knew that as long as they were alive, evil would never rest. They must remain vigilant, ready to confront new horrors and never give evil the opportunity to take over. Their fight was just beginning while the residents of Ashford were resting. A new danger was looming over the city. The dark forces, from which the group of saviors strengthened the cemetery, began to show more and more active activity, preparing for a new awakening. One fine evening there was a crash in Ashford and the ground was cluttered up. Residents, frightened by this event, ran out of their houses and saw a terrible sight. The cemetery, which was supposed to be sealed, burst into flames, and the revived dead began to get out. Their distorted bodies were covered with huge wounds and rottenness, and their screams were filled with inhuman crazed agony. The grass was withering, the trees looked withered, and the air was filled with bitterness and despair. The group of saviors, who had been on guard and fighting evil all this time, gathered again, suddenly realizing that their mission was far from over. Edward, never discouraged and believing in victory, took the lead, realizing that they must find the source of the dark forces feeding the living dead. They went to the old neglected chapel, which served as a sinister sanctuary for the dead. Inside, they found an altar covered in blood, and an ancient scroll on which were carved mysterious group of survivors I was part of was retreating along a forest path, gripped by blinding fear and overcome by a thirst to survive. The living dead, bringing death and destruction, pursued us with obsessive determination. Their eyes were empty and lifeless, but that didn't stop them from continuing to move forward like mindless puppets. Our legs were tired, and our breathing turned into intermittent snuffling. We understood that we would not escape from this death unless we found a way to stop it. Turning to the knowledge accumulated in the field of mysticism and occultism, one of our group, Lucas, offered us a difficult solution to try to penetrate into the very heart of darkness, Necropolis, where strange rituals took place, awakening the dead from their eternal sleep. Following his suggestion, we passed through the flaming frame and found ourselves in the very epicenter of the diabolical battle between the living and the dead. Our hearts were pounding so loudly that even the undead could be heard. We saw the flaming jagged teeth of the living dead, and their blood merged with the burning torches of the necropolis, creating an ominous combination of fire and death. However, we were still struggling. We were determined and strong, the last who survived, the last who could resist this horror. We knew that the great danger would stop only when we reached the original source of this vile curse. Time dragged on, but we continued our way through the necropolis maze. Every step brought new fears and threats, but we had to fight them. face the dead and the devouring evil they represented. Finally, we reached the central altar, on top of which towered a menacing, distorted image of the ancient god of death. It glittered in the light of flickering candles and allowed us to feel the real essence of this hell. We knew that it was here that we had to take all our strength and make the last leap. After fixing each other with a confident look, we focused and revealed our secrets. By resurrecting the forgotten magic words, we tried to enclose this infernal energy back into the sacred place from where it escaped. The worlds collided, and the terrible screams of the living dead mixed with the sound of our victorious cry. Chaos gave way to a revived order, and the dead, doomed to eternal wandering, turned back to ashes. But by doing so, we have only temporarily defeated the darkness. The incarnate essence of evil has left its former refuge and spread throughout the world. We did not cope with one battle, but we will return to the fight. After all, there is only one victory, and we are alive, and as long as we breathe, we will fight. How many more lives will have to be sacrificed to win? Only time will tell. We were surrounded by the living dead, who pressed us harder and harder. Their cold, distorted faces and the vile smell of decomposition made us gasp with horror. Our group lacked the strength and weapons to repel this avalanche of death. The disappointing reality covered us like a gloomy cloak, and all hopes of salvation faded. We tried desperately to resist, but with every second the revived dead became stronger and more merciless. We were overcome with despair when they penetrated our ranks, destroying our last hopes of salvation. Our leader, Max, fearlessly held on until the last moment, stubbornly fighting against this darkness of a converted life. He knew death was coming, but he didn't want to leave us. In a last attempt to reverse the course of events, Max decided to attract the attention of the living dead in order to give the survivors a chance to survive. He stepped forward and attracted the attention of the dead, making loud noises and moving faster than expected. A terrible hissing and growling filled the air, and the revived dead rushed to Max, forgetting about the rest of us. It was the moment of truth. Our group, shackled by fear and despair, was able to take advantage of the moment and escape. Our horror for Max enveloped us, but he himself resisted the onslaught of the living dead. The fateful decision to sacrifice his life to save the others glorified him as a hero. We ran through the woods without turning around until we were at a safe distance from this nightmare. Pausing for a moment, we remembered Max and the legendary act of his self-sacrifice. His heroic sacrifice will forever remain in our hearts and in the history of the struggle with the living dead. But some questions remained unanswered. What led to the rebirth of the dead? And can they come back again? Questions that will torment us further. Maybe our next mission is to uncover the secrets of this horror and find a way to finally stop the resurrection of the dead. Darkness awaits us, but we will not give up. We will continue our struggle and search for the truth. Time will show what lies behind this terrible curse, and only our determination and courage will help us to end this nightmarish threat that arose from the worlds of funerary silence.